And last September, following the protests and the violence in Charlottesville, I wrote a column. I wrote a column about that experience. And what I really wrote was something personal, which I don't do very often. And I wrote that as a white, straight Christian male, I have never experienced persecution, discrimination, or exclusion because of my race, sexuality, beliefs, or gender. I don't know what it is like to feel overlooked or underpaid or to worry about sexual harassment. I don't worry about how I might be viewed or treated for what I wear or what I believe, or to be lumped in with those who commit acts of terrorism because they claim to be part of my same faith group. I don't fear violence or discrimination because of who I choose to love and marry, unlike my LGBTQ friends. And I don't have to worry about whether or not my religion is acceptable. Canadian society is set up to accommodate my beliefs, even giving me days off for Christmas and Good Friday. And as we were reminded tragically this morning, I don't have to worry about gunmen coming into my place of worship to kill me or my family. So you can say that I'm a lucky person because I was born into the right place, the right gender, and with all the privileges that those imply. So when I read about something like Charlottesville or New Zealand yesterday, and all the hate that happens in the world today, they alarm and they concern me, but they don't affect me personally. I know that I am not the target of discrimination and hate. So if I'm going to understand what that feels like, I'm going to have to talk to people from those communities and ask them what it feels like to worry about going to synagogue or to worry about going to mosque or any other place where some violence might happen or something could be said. And that's what I did in that column. I shared some of those personal things from other people, and that's what we're going to hear about today as well. We're going to hear from two people, Jewish and Muslim, telling us what it's like to be members of those religions in Canada and in Winnipeg today, a time when, as we heard and as we know, hatred against Jews and Muslims is rising. So our panelists are Chana Thau and Azeezah Kanji. Chana is mainly retired, but does occasional projects as a personal and oral historian. As a Jew and a child of Holocaust survivors, she is particularly troubled by the current surge in anti-Semitism and racism in general. And Azeezah is an academic and writer whose work finds her focusing on issues related to racism, law, and social justice. Among other things, her goal is to understand and resist the portrayal of Muslims as a security threat and to push back the pall of suspicion that has been cast on all Muslims, a pall that produces a pressure to prove to the rest of the world that they are not dangerous terrorists. So we'll start with you, Chana. Our timekeeper here in the front will hold up a piece of paper that indicates when you have 5 minutes left, and then we'll proceed from there. So please start.
Okay, it's working. First, I can't start without also commenting how shocked and grieving we all are at the tragedy of the shootings at the New Zealand mosques. People have already referred to the other shooting at the Quebec mosque a couple of years ago, and the Jewish community was sent reeling in October of 2018 when there was the shooting at the Pittsburgh synagogue, also during worship, in the deadliest attack in US history on Jews. We had a vigil at the Shaare Zedek synagogue to which actually the synagogue had to turn people away. So many people came from all over the city, from all over all different religions to show their solidarity. And I'm glad to see, we had our NDP leader come in, and there will be more of that, sadly. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're on Treaty 1 land. And as a child of immigrants, one of whom was a refugee, I find myself in the odd position of being both a proud first-generation Canadian, but a reluctant, embarrassed member of white colonialist Canada. Only when I was an adult, well into adulthood, did I learn about the past and ongoing injustices against Canada's Indigenous peoples. I'm here mainly to give a personal perspective, but I was asked to give a brief history of anti-Semitism in Canada, which of course includes a history of Jews in Canada and is not that lengthy. But first I'd like to define the term. In the Oxford Dictionary, it's defined as hostility to or prejudice against Jews. It can take the form of verbal, written, or physical assault, graffiti, desecration of synagogues and Jewish cemeteries, to name but a few. The most extreme, relatively recent example is the Holocaust, or Shoah, genocide in which Nazi Germany, aided by its collaborators, systematically murdered some 6 million European Jews, around 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe, between 1941 and 1945. As well, the Nazis persecuted and murdered other people, other groups, notably the Roma or Gypsies, the, quote, incurably sick, political and religious dissenters like communists and Jehovah's Witnesses, as well as gay men. The Jews, like Muslims, Christians, Yazidis, and others who are visible minorities in some way in the countries where they lived, have a long history of persecution in those countries. I'm not going to go into, I did so much research. Although a handful of Jews immigrated to Canada before the 20th century, by 1901, the population numbered over 16,000. Anti-Semitism elsewhere was a major cause of the increase in immigration. There were pogroms in Russia, whereby the Cossacks would just plunder, kill, burn, rape Jewish villages and cities. In the following decade, more arrived, and by 1931, there were 156,000 Jews in Canada. Unfortunately, the anti-Semitism dates back to then as well. In the province of Quebec, where the Roman Catholic Church exerted a strong influence, the Jews were discriminated against because they were seen as Christ killers. In the Great Depression in the 30s, they were often scapegoated and accused of controlling the finances and dominating the fragile job market. Alberta's Social Credit Party, under Bill Aberhart, blamed Jews and communism for the Depression. Then there was the academic discrimination. Jews were subject to admission quotas at universities across the country. In the early 30s, McGill University introduced a Jewish quota whereby Jews had to have higher marks than others to be admitted. In 1933, in referring to admission of Jewish scholars trying to flee persecution in Europe, McGill's Dean of Arts stated in a personal communication as that Jewish people are of no use to us in this country. As a race of men, Jews do not fit in with higher civilization. In Manitoba, too, the University of Manitoba had quotas on admission of Jews to its medical schools, instituted in 1932 by the Dean of Medicine, Dean Mather. When it was investigated in 1943, it was shown that, first of all, on the admission form to university, you had to give your race. Then they found out there were 4 lists. The first for Jews, the second for women, the third for Europeans, and the fourth, the preferred list for Anglo-Saxon, French Canadian, and Icelandic students. There was a lot of protest among the Jewish community, the non-Jewish community. The quota wasn't lifted till the early 50s. And then perhaps the largest display, and little known, I just found out about it recently, of anti-Semitism before the war, occurred in Toronto in August 1933. The Christie Pitts riot was a massive riot which ensued when Jewish baseball players, who also numbered Italians among them because they couldn't be on the Protestant team, were at the Christie Pitts Park, were taunted by an anti-Semitic youth group using swastikas as their symbol, called the Pitt Gang. It is and was the largest single eruption of ethnic violence in post-Confederation Canadian history. And I'd like to point out here that a young local Jewish author, Jamie Michaels, has just completed a graphic novel about this little-known event called The Christie Pitts. It will be launched at McNally Robinson on March 23rd. Then a much more significant, well, a larger scope event was during the war in 1939, a ship called the St. Louis. Has anybody heard of this event? A few people. It's also shown at the Human Rights Museum here. It was carrying over 900 Jewish refugees from Hitler's Germany and was supposed to land in Cuba, was refused entry. So then the captain requested admission to Canada and the US and was denied to both. So he finally returned the ship to Europe, where various European countries accepted some people. Many were later caught in Nazi roundups of Jews in occupied countries, and historians have estimated that about a quarter of them died in death camps during the Second World War. In November 2018, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau issued a long overdue apology for Canada's actions then. It's also well known, but maybe not, because apparently a lot of young people today have not even heard much about the Holocaust, if at all. In World War II, Canada's immigration minister under Prime Minister Mackenzie King was Frederick Blair. When he was asked how many refugees, Jewish refugees, Canada would accept, he said, "None is too many." That's the title and the subject of a book by Toronto historians Irving Abella and Ralph Troper that appeared in 1983. Until that point, I always blithely assumed that I was living in this wonderful democracy that was Canada, where Jews were not subject to any discrimination. It was a rude shock. Since this recent history of the World War II and the Holocaust pertains directly to my family's experience, I will try and tell you a short form of it, because I grew up with the Holocaust weighing heavily on me. Both my parents were born in Poland. My mother's father immigrated to Canada, to Winnipeg, in 1929 as a single man, because that was the easiest way to gain admission. He worked hard and brought my grandmother and the 3 younger children over in 1937. But my mother and her older sister, who were already over 21, had to stay behind till he could find the means and the sponsorship for them. Those 2 young women left in July 1939 on one of the last boats out of Poland before the Nazi invasion in September. My father stayed behind. He, his mother, and my mother's cousin were on a train headed for the concentration camps. He and the cousin jumped out of the train as it was crossing a bridge over a river. Both were shot, the latter fatally. My father got a bullet in his leg, but swam the river and somehow managed to survive the war by variously hiding, spending time in a Russian jail, in the Russian army. He weighed 75 pounds at the end of the war and managed to make his way to Palestine in 1945. He and my mom had met before the war. He somehow retained her address throughout all his adventures, and she got a postcard from him in 1940, mid-40s, and a romance developed. He wanted to come to Canada, but those were the days of none is too many. In the end, my mom's CCF, which was the precursor of the NDP, Member of Parliament for Winnipeg North, brought a private member's bill to enable these star-crossed lovers to be reunited. My dad was forever grateful and would go for years to shovel the snow from Alistair Stewart's sidewalk in appreciation. I'm given the time signal. My siblings and I grew up with many stories of the Holocaust, of family members we would never know, and my dad awaking shrieking from nightmares. We were educated in a Jewish home and Jewish schools to be proud of our religion and ethnicity and to never forget the Holocaust so it could never recur. Canada seemed like a very benign and tolerant society, but my dad used to regularly repeat that the Holocaust could happen again. Indeed, his older siblings had left Poland for Germany and were doing very well there as citizens. But when Hitler was rising to power, they sent their teenage children to Palestine, just in case. They stayed behind and perished. Although my sister and I never experienced any overt anti-Semitism growing up, my brother was often beaten up on his way to our Jewish school 2 blocks away by neighborhood boys. Why? Because he was identifiably Jewish. While we were growing up, it was known that Jews were not welcome to live in tuxedo, and they were excluded from joining many social clubs such as the Winnipeg Club and the Squash Racket Club. The Jewish Glendale Golf Club was established because Jews were excluded from all others. And in fact, Winnipeg Beach on Lake Manitoba was developed as a largely Jewish resort because Jews weren't allowed at Grand Beach on the other side of the lake, which had the nicer beaches. In recent times, anti-Semitism, as everyone knows from the news, has increasingly manifested itself in Europe, in the United States, and even here. Holocaust denial is another facet of modern-day anti-Semitism. Two famous cases in Canada are those of Ernest Zundel and of James Keegstra. Zundel was a German who lived in Canada for over 40 years and was known for his Holocaust denial utterances and publications. He was ultimately convicted of hate crimes and deported in 2005. Keegstra, however, was a public school teacher and the mayor of Eckville, Alberta. He taught his social studies students that the Holocaust was a fraud and described Jews to his students as all the stereotypes: treacherous, subversive, money-loving, power-hungry, child killers. He felt that the Jews had created the Holocaust for sympathy. He taught his students the myth of a Jewish worldwide conspiracy. He was charged and convicted of hate speech in 1984. It was overturned by the Court of Appeal, but later reinstated by the Supreme Court of Canada. This became a landmark Canadian legal case upholding the constitutionality of Canada's hate speech laws. Winnipeg is not immune to manifestations of anti-Semitism, even today. Last December, a home in Wolseley was defaced with graffiti in response to the Hanukkah menorah in the window. In the past, gravestones in Jewish cemeteries have been overturned or defaced here, as well as other cities. And at the beginning of 2019, Burmack's Cafe on Corridon Avenue, owned by an observant Jewish family, found the word Jew spray painted on the windows and in their parking lot. Winnipeg Police reports that the incident is being looked into by hate crimes investigators within the Major Crimes Unit. Why the rise in anti-Semitism now? I would say for the same reasons that there has been a rise in Islamophobia, rooted in fear of the other, differing from the, quote, norm. In a recent article in The Guardian, John Powell discusses othering, the mentality of us versus them as a human response to social change. Overwhelmingly, people don't know those that they are treating as others, but they know they are different. Who gets defined as other differs from place to place and can be based on race, religion, nationality, or language. I'd like to add that I'm very troubled by the recent trend whereby anti-Semitism is being perpetuated under the guise of so-called anti-Zionism. The term Zionism was coined by Theodor Herzl in the late 1890s and referred to Jewish self-determination in its ancestral land. Herzl was convinced that it was impossible for Jews to assimilate in the countries where they lived as a diaspora as long as there was anti-Semitism. While Zionism and Israel are linked to our modern Jewish experience, there are 2 points I'd like to stress. First, not all Jews agree with Benjamin Netanyahu's politics, with the oppression of Palestinians and with the occupation of the West Bank. Second, anti-Zionist sentiments or critiques of Israel should in no way translate into, justify, or promote anti-Semitic acts and sentiments. Although people who perpetrate such acts profess to be anti-Zionist and not anti-Jewish, their acts usually demonstrate that they are both. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's working definition of anti-Semitism states that manifestations might include the targeting of the State of Israel conceived as a Jewish collectivity. It does go on to say that criticism of Israel, similar to that leveled against any other country, cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic, but you see there's a very fine line there. So just to conclude, while anxiety about change is natural, othering is not. Othering is socially and culturally constructed. This applies to anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, discrimination against indigenous peoples, the Yazidi people with whom I've been working, and many other groups across the world. If we are to combat the rising tide of extremism across the globe, we must actively build bridges across differences. Conferences like this one are of vital importance in building these bridges, and I wish they were better attended.
Thank you. Thank you for that historical survey. It's easy for us, younger people in particular, to remember that it's not so long ago when that was the experience right here in Winnipeg. So thanks for reminding us of that, Azeezah.
Thank you, and Assalamu alaikum, greetings of peace at this time when our feelings of peace have been so deeply and fundamentally shattered. I'm not going to talk at all about my personal experiences with Islamophobia on this panel. It's a common dynamic in conferences and panels that the Indigenous, Black, or Muslim Jewish speakers are invited primarily to talk about their personal experiences, while the white people seem to be the ones who are there to deliver the universal remarks on theory and philosophy. I think that this is a dynamic that fundamentally serves to perpetuate white supremacy so that the experiences of racism by racialized communities are always seen as individual and personal instances divorced from structural considerations. And so I'm not going to talk at all about my personal experiences. At this time, when we are consumed by grief and shock and anger with what happened in New Zealand, I think it's important for us to take a step back to acknowledge the fact that this massacre that was perpetuated against Muslims at their Jummah prayers in New Zealand is the third act of mass carnage in a Muslim or Jewish space in worship to occur in a settler colonial state in the last 3 years. Settler colonialism being itself an inherently and irredeemably violent political system in which the foundational violence against indigenous nations is inextricably linked to logics of anti-Black racism, anti-Muslim racism, and anti-Jewish racism. The name of one of the mosques that was targeted in the attack on New Zealand is the An-Nur Mosque. In Toronto, I also work for an Islamic center that carries the name Nur. It's a very beautiful word in the Arabic language. Nur means light. It's the light that helps us to see not only physically, but also intellectually and spiritually. And I think what we see every time these instances of white supremacist violence happen is that there's a deliberate will not to see the way that these acts of violence are connected to each other and are part of a colonial racial system of governance and politics. That a political system that has been built on colonial and racial violence will continue to produce violence against communities that are colonized and racialized as long as those foundations remain intact and undecolonized. This picture that we have here is a screenshot that was sent to me by my brother of the homepage of CBC News this morning. I think it's making its priorities of what it considers to be newsworthy very clear. A scandal about rich people paying to have their children admitted to college is given top billing over an act of violence that killed 49 people, 49 Muslims in prayer in New Zealand. CBC, we already knew that you didn't consider our lives to be worth so much when during the Quebec mosque shooting, you refused to suspend your regular programming and instead considered airing, as usual, a panel discussion in which panelists speculated that Islamophobia in Canada is due to the fact that people don't understand why Muslims pray 5 times a day. Absolutely ridiculous. And this is just rubbing further salt in the wound that tells us that our humanity is not recognized as being fully human. Yesterday night, when I went on the website of CNN to try and find news about what was happening, we had heard that between 6 and a dozen Muslims had been killed in New Zealand. I went on the website of CNN to try and find out the latest updates, and I could barely find the story on the website. It was buried towards the bottom of the site, no picture, and what it said was New Zealand police responding to firearm incident. This is how a white supremacist attack on a mosque was described, as a firearm incident that police were responding to. One of the ways that we see how these perpetual acts of white supremacist violence are represented as being random and isolated incidents is with this adjective we always see trotted out whenever one of these acts of violence happens. It's described as senseless. This is how Donald Trump described it on his Twitter feed when he was issuing condolences to the families bereaved in New Zealand. He called it a senseless act, when in reality we know that these eruptions of violence are the product of a extremely dangerous common sense about Muslims, about indigenous communities, about racialized communities that have been deeply entrenched in our political systems in order to justify our ongoing domination and dispossession. So when Donald Trump sends his warm wishes to New Zealanders for the loss that they have incurred, thanks, but no thanks, Donald Trump. We would rather that you stop spewing the garbage of white supremacy that made him such an attractive figure to the New Zealand shooter, so that he cited him in his white supremacist manifesto that he posted. We seem to be able to come up with 1,001 excuses for the violence of white men against indigenous and racialized people. When Alec Manassian ran over 10 people in a van in a street in Toronto, the narrative that the dominant media first picked up on was the fact that he might have been autistic, as if people experiencing mental health crises are not many times more likely to suffer violence in our society than they are to be the perpetrators of violence. Forget the fact that Alec Manassian, we know, was deeply involved in the discourse of involuntary celibacy or incel discourse. Even after this had been determined, spokespeople from CSIS, our national security agency, said that they had never heard of incel before, and they were not planning on continuing to monitor incel websites. I guess they're too busy harassing and surveilling indigenous land and water protectors, environmentalists, and Muslim university students. We managed to find 1,001 reasons to excuse the violence of white men. Gerald Stanley, his gun fired accidentally somehow directly into the back of indigenous youth Colton Bushy's head. Peter Kill, a man from Hamilton, Ontario, who admitted that he shot and killed an indigenous man who he found in his car. He was acquitted of murder because his fatal overreaction was chalked up to the fact that he had had military training, and so this was an understandable exercise of self-defense on his part. God forbid that we question the white supremacist roots of such a military training and whether it is responsible to be sending people who have received such training to the killing fields of Afghanistan and Iraq, let alone let them come back to Canada without having undergone the kind of de-radicalization or counter-radicalization training that is continuously being prescribed for Muslims who have political views that are considered to be problematic. The problem is not that we have guns malfunctioning and firing into the back of people's heads, but that we have certain communities that have been systematically placed in the firing lines of white supremacy. And this is not only at the hands of actors like the New Zealand mosque shooter, but also at the hands of our police. And so right now we also hold in our hearts and honor our South Sudanese brother who was killed by Winnipeg police recently when he was in a moment of mental crisis, but instead of receiving love and care, he received violence. When we talk about white supremacy, there's often this puzzlement about where it comes from, and I see that I have 1 minute left. There's this air of surprise that we would have white supremacy in Canada, and we think, is it because of Trump and it's being imported into our country? No, the roots of white supremacy go back centuries to that foundational moment in 1492 when Columbus stumbled across land that had been the home and protected space of an indigenous nations for many thousands of years, and Europeans after him decided that they needed to come up with reasons for how they could treat as terra nullius, no one's land that had been people's land for thousands of years. This legacy of settler colonialism is intimately intertwined with Christian histories of anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish discourse, which informed the settler colonial project in North America, so that ideas like terra nullius, ideas about sexual and gender deviancy, were transferred from Jewish and Muslim populations to the populations that were colonized in North America. So if we actually want to address the roots of racism that lead to the types of violence that we saw in New Zealand, we cannot continue to cover them up, but we must unroot them and expose them, because these medieval histories that we heard about at a previous panel on Christian discourses that produce violence, they are not dead and buried in the past. They are living and continue to inflict violence in our colonial presence. And indeed, they just took 49 lives in New Zealand today. May they rest in power, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. Greetings of peace and thank you.